Let me tell you something about the moment I knew the galaxy was broken. Not cracked, not strained, broken. It wasn't when the Velkari fleets burned 3 human colonies on the Outer Arm. It wasn't when the Galactic Compact signed the Thessian Accords and quietly handed humanity a second-class citizen badge with a smile and a diplomatic handshake. It wasn't even when they started charging us oxygen tariffs on stations we built with our own hands, our own steel, our own dead. No, it was a single night, a single corridor, a single girl barely 16 in her species years, crouched behind a smashed cargo crate in a docking bay on Mercenary Station, while her Royal Guard detail stood 30 meters away and decided she wasn't worth dying for. That's the moment. That's the one I keep coming back to. Because I was there. I saw the whole thing. And I am going to tell you exactly what happened, every ugly, exact second of it, because someone needs to. Because the official record says something different, and the official record is a lie dressed up in diplomatic language and filed under 17 different security classifications that will conveniently never be declassified in our lifetimes. So sit down. This is the real story. Set up. Mercenary Station sits at the intersection of 3 major trade lanes in what humans informally call the mid-arm. That sprawling, cluttered band of systems between the Compact's core territories and the contested frontier where nobody's law means very much. If you've never been to Mercenary, imagine someone took a small moon, hollowed it out completely, and then let about 60 different species spend 200 years building inside it without agreeing on a single architectural standard. Every corridor is slightly different. Every level has different gravity calibration depending on which species built it originally. There are sections of Mercenary where the ceiling is 4 feet high because it was designed by the Dreth, who average about 3.5 feet tall, and considered human-scale construction an absurd waste of vertical space. The station processes roughly 40,000 arrivals and departures every standard day. It is loud, it is busy, it smells like 6 different atmospheres being recycled through filters that haven't been properly cleaned since the last station administrator quit in disgust, and it is, by most assessments, one of the most politically significant neutral waypoints in this entire sector of the galaxy. Which is why the Thessian royal delegation chose it for their transit stop. I need to explain who the Thessians are, because a lot of humans don't know, and the ones who do often get it wrong from reading Compact-approved histories. The Thessians, formerly the Thessian hegemony, are one of the older species in the Galactic Compact. They've been spacefaring for roughly 6,000 years by our count. They are tall, averaging about 7 feet, with a deep blue-violet bioluminescence that pulses along the ridge lines of their skull and down the back of their necks. Their skin is a gray-silver that catches light strangely, almost like mother of pearl. They have 4 eyes, 2 forward-facing like humans, 2 positioned at the temples for wider peripheral vision. And they communicate through a combination of verbal language and chromatic shifts in their bioluminescence that carry emotional and contextual nuance that their spoken words sometimes don't. They were, at the time of this story, one of the 3 most politically powerful species in the Galactic Compact. Their royal house, the House of Velthessa, had ruled their hegemony for 2,000 years, not democracy, not a council. A monarchy, full and real, with a queen whose word was constitutional law, and whose family held the actual levers of power in ways that made human constitutional monarchies look like student government. The current queen, Thessia Velkarath III, had 1 daughter, Princess Eva Velkarath, 16 years old in Thessian years. By their developmental timeline, that's roughly equivalent to a human 13-year-old in terms of emotional and social development, though her intellectual development was apparently considerably more advanced. The Thessians mature differently. Their emotional landscape develops slower. Their intellectual capacity develops faster. Eva was, by all accounts I've since collected, a remarkably curious, remarkably stubborn, and remarkably isolated young woman who had spent most of her life inside palace walls and compact diplomatic functions, where every single person around her was performing rather than being real with her. She was on Mercenary Station as part of a diplomatic transit. Her mother, Queen Thesha, was traveling separately on a different vessel. Standard royal security protocol. Never put both on the same ship. And Eva was traveling with a royal guard detail of 12 Velkarii soldiers and 4 Theshan diplomatic staff. The Velkarii are the Theshan royal guard, elite soldiers. They serve the throne directly, they are appointed by the queen personally, and they are, by reputation, supposed to be the most loyal soldiers in the hegemony. Fanatically loyal. Die for the royal family loyal. That is the reputation. I am here to tell you what happened when the reputation met reality. Now me. My name is Drav Holton. I'm from New Cascade, that's the 3rd planet in the Hello system, out near the frontier. Small colony world. Agricultural mostly. My parents grew something called ridge wheat, which is a hardier variant engineered for low-water soil, and we were comfortable enough, never wealthy. I had 2 brothers. One of them still farms. The other one works engineering on a transport hauler doing the Hilos to Kandara run. Me, I left at 17. Not because I hated home. I want to make that clear. I loved it. I still love it. I left because I was restless in a way that I didn't have words for at 17 and that I understand slightly better now at 32. I needed to see what was out there. What I found out there was that the galaxy is enormous, frequently beautiful, occasionally terrifying, and operates on a fundamental principle that I can summarize simply. The more powerful you are, the more the rules bend toward you. That's not cynicism. That's observation. I spent 3 years in the Frontier Coalition's Auxiliary Security Forces. Not a real military, more like a licensed defense contractor operating under compact regulations in systems too distant from compact core worlds for regular enforcement. We did perimeter defense on mining operations, crowd management on trade stations, escort work for transport convoys through regions where piracy was a problem. I was decent at it. Not exceptional. Decent. I was good at reading situations and reading people, or at least, reading the species I'd spent enough time around to understand. I was also good at staying calm when things went wrong, which turns out to be a rarer skill than it sounds. After the Coalition gig, I spent a year doing private security consulting, which mostly meant I was a glorified bodyguard for mid-level compact merchants who were nervous about the frontier. Then I got connected with a small independent security firm, 4 humans, 2 Dreth, 1 Skethian, and we operated as freelance security specialists. Nice professional word for mercenaries, though we preferred security specialists for the obvious business development reasons. By the time I arrived on Mercenary Station, I had 11 years of experience across about 30 different systems. I spoke 4 languages passably and 2 more at a survival level. And I had a reputation in the independent security community for being solid, professional, and genuinely trustworthy about client confidentiality. That last part matters more than people think. I was on Mercenary for a client pickup, a Skethian merchant who had hired us to escort a shipment of rare biological samples back to Kandara. The merchant's ship was delayed by about 18 hours due to a docking queue backup, and I had 18 hours to kill. I was in the level 4 commercial district, one of the more human comfortable levels, standard gravity, nitrogen-oxygen mix, reasonable ceiling height. Eating something that was allegedly a noodle dish from a stall run by a very optimistic Firian who had clearly studied human food preferences from a checklist and made several interesting interpretive choices. The noodles were strange, not bad, just strange. I was sitting there, minding my business, watching the station crowd flow past me the way you do when you have 18 hours and nothing specific to do. There's a kind of peace in that. Stations like Mercenary have their own rhythm. You can sit in a food court and watch an entire living ecosystem of species and commerce and motion and argument and transaction. And if you're patient and observant, you start to read it like a language. I had been sitting there for about 40 minutes when the Thessian Royal Guard detail walked through. You couldn't miss them. 12 Velkarii soldiers in full ceremonial and tactical hybrid armor. The Thessians don't really separate those two functions the way humans do. Their armor is always both things at once. The armor was deep blue-black with gold bioluminescent inlay that pulsed in synchronization with the soldiers' own natural bioluminescence. They were big. The Thessian soldiers averaged nearly 7.5 feet, and the armor added another visual 2 inches. They moved in a formation that was technically relaxed but clearly trained, loose column, spacing maintained, each soldier's field of view overlapping with the next. In the middle of the formation, surrounded on all sides, was the princess. My first look at Eva Velkarath. She was smaller than her guards. Thessians are smaller in youth. They don't hit their full height until late development. And she was wearing what I later learned was a modified civilian traveling outfit, something deliberately low-key for transit rather than the full ceremonial dress her rank would usually demand. It was still clearly expensive. The fabric had that particular shimmer that either means genuine chromatic weave or a very good synthetic imitation. And the cut had that look that whispers old money rather than screaming it. But what I actually noticed was her posture. She wasn't walking the way the diplomatic staff around her walked. The staff walked with that careful, calculated composure that you develop when your entire job is projecting controlled competence in public. The guards walked with the military uprightness of people whose physical bearing is part of their professional identity. Eva walked like someone who was somewhere she didn't want to be, trying very hard to look like she wasn't. Small thing, subtle. But I've spent 11 years reading rooms and reading people, and some things you just notice. I watched the detail move through the commercial district and disappear toward the restricted transit corridors, and I went back to my strange noodles, and I thought nothing more of it for the next 2 hours. Build tension. The station alert system on Mercenary is not subtle. It is a series of tonal signals, different pitches and patterns for different alert categories, layered over a visual display system that changes the ambient lighting in public areas. Yellow means general attention. Orange means elevated concern. Red means immediate danger. At roughly 23:40 station time, I had been back in my temporary quarters for about an hour, going over the next day's escort logistics. The lights went orange. The station PA announced, in the standard multi-language rotation, elevated security situation, level 7 docking bays, all non-essential personnel please clear the area, security teams to level 7. Level 7. That's the deep cargo and high security transit docking level, not where general passengers move through. Where high priority, high security transfers happen, VIP arrivals, sensitive cargo, the kind of traffic that doesn't want to share a corridor with the general public. It's where a royal guard detail would route a princess. I was out of my quarters before I fully consciously decided to move. 11 years of this work builds certain automatic responses. Orange alert near a location you've recently associated with a high-value principle is not something your body waits for your brain to analyze. I grabbed my gear, light tactical jacket, the small kit I carry as standard, the sidearm I was licensed to carry on Mercenary under my current security contractor credentials, and I headed for level 7. The corridors between my level and level 7 were already clearing, station staff and civilian traffic moving away from the alert zone. I moved against the flow, which got me a few looks but nobody tried to stop me. Orange alert doesn't trigger lockdown, just advisory, and my contractor ID flagged me as authorized security personnel, which was technically true even if my current contract wasn't with Mercenary Station. The descent to level 7 involved 2 elevator shafts and a connecting maintenance corridor. I took the maintenance route because I wanted to arrive without announcing myself through the main access points, which would have logged my arrival in the station's movement system with more precision than I wanted right then. The maintenance corridor came out behind a secondary service access point about 60 meters from the main docking bay entrance. I came through the service access, quiet, controlled, staying close to the wall, and I got my first look at what was happening. The docking bay was large, standard heavy cargo dimensions, high ceilings, maybe 25 feet, with a grid of industrial lighting that cast everything in the cold, flat white of functional illumination, rather than the warmer tones of commercial spaces. The bay smelled like engine discharge, recycled atmosphere, and something chemical that I later identified as weapon discharge residue, which told me this situation was further along than an orange alert usually implies. The bay had 3 main docking cradles. The centermost cradle held a ship, a mid-sized diplomatic transport, the kind the Theshan delegation would have used, all clean lines and that particular blue-gray hull color that Theshan ships favor. The ship was powered down in cradle, which meant it wasn't going anywhere. That was the first wrong thing I noticed. If this was a security situation and the ship was the high-value asset, you power up the ship and you get the principal aboard and you get out. Powered down ship means either they couldn't power it up or they chose not to. The second wrong thing was the positioning of the Valkyrie soldiers. 10 of the 12 were at the far end of the bay, near the main entrance, which was the end opposite from where I was standing. They were in a combat stance cluster formation, facing inward toward the bay, weapons drawn, but they weren't moving, they weren't advancing, they were just standing there, watching. Between them and the ship, roughly in the middle of the bay, there was a standoff situation in progress. About 8 figures on one side. I identified them quickly. Kavith, medium-height bipeds, stocky, with the distinctive gray-green scale plating that covers about 60% of their surface area. Kavith are a frontier species, not compact members, operating in the contested zones that the compact claims nominal jurisdiction over but doesn't actually effectively police. Their reputation in security circles is that they work for whoever pays them, they're competent, and they have no particular compunction about violence. They were armed. I could see the distinctive silhouettes of Kavith pulse weapons, which fire concussive bursts that can incapacitate most species without killing, but can certainly kill if the setting is wrong. On the other side, and this is where everything in my brain suddenly sharpened to a very fine, very cold point, was Eva Velkarath. The princess was crouched behind the wreckage of what had been a cargo pallet mover, one of the large automated vehicles that moves freight around docking bays. It was tipped on its side, clearly from an earlier burst of weapons fire, and she had gotten herself behind it. She was small enough that she was mostly covered by the wreckage. But only mostly. And the 8 Kavith between her and her guards had positioned themselves to cut her off from the main bay entrance. I processed the situation in about 3 seconds. The Kavith had separated the princess from her guard detail. The guard detail was at the far end of the bay with clear sight lines, but blocked by the Kavith formation from reaching her without crossing ground under fire. The ship was powered down. Either the ship's crew had locked it remotely as a security measure, or the Kavith had done something to prevent it from being used as escape. And the 12 Valkyrie royal guards, the elite soldiers of the Theshan hegemony, the ones whose entire identity and professional purpose is the protection of the royal house, were standing at the far end of the bay. Not advancing, not flanking, not doing anything. I want to be careful here because I want to be fair. There are military and security situations where holding position is the tactically correct choice. There are scenarios where advancing recklessly into a position gets your principal killed. There are situations where you hold and you wait and you look for the right angle. I spent about 30 seconds watching the Valkyrie and trying to construct that interpretation of what I was seeing. I couldn't make it work. Because here's the thing, they had angles. Level 7 has multiple access points. The service corridor I'd come through myself demonstrates that. A 12-soldier detail of trained elite fighters with knowledge of the station layout had options. They could flank. They could split, send a smaller group through secondary access to come at the caveth from a different direction while the main group maintained position. They could use the distraction of the standoff to get 2 or 3 soldiers behind the caveth while the rest held attention at the front. They weren't doing any of that. They were standing in a cluster, weapons out, and they were communicating with each other through their bioluminescence. I could see the rapid chromatic shifts rippling through the group, but they weren't moving. And Eva was crouched behind that tipped cargo mover with the caveth 8 meters from her, and closing the distance very slowly, methodically, in the manner of people who have done this before and know that patience wins. I also want to note, 2 of the diplomatic staff were with the main guard cluster. The other 2 were somewhere I couldn't see, possibly evacuated, possibly elsewhere in the station. But the guards and the diplomatic staff were together, and they were intact, and the princess was alone on the wrong side of the bay. The calculus of what had happened started to arrange itself in my mind, and it was ugly. When a protection detail gets separated from their principal, there are 2 possible explanations. The first is tactical accident, chaotic situation, separation happened, now recovery. The second is something else, something darker. The caveth hadn't shot Eva. They were moving toward her slowly in a converging pattern that read to me less like they intended to kill her and more like they intended to take her, alive, carefully. An extraction, not an assassination. Which means someone hired them to take the princess. Which means someone knew she would be on this level, at this time, with a guard detail that, for whatever reason, wasn't going to stop them. I crouched in the shadow of the service access doorway, and I thought about it for about 4 more seconds. Then I stopped thinking about it and started doing the thing. Climax. Here is something they don't tell you in any of the official tactical training courses I've been through, and there have been several. The most important factor in any active threat situation is often not your weapons, not your position, not your firepower, not any of the technical elements they teach you. It's commitment. The moment between deciding to act and starting to act is where most people fail, not because they make the wrong decision, because they hesitate, because they second guess, because they try to hold on to the safety of inaction one moment too long. I have, through 11 years and several experiences I will not detail here, learned to close that gap. To get the decision made and then commit to it fully, without reservation, because hesitation in an active situation is a physical liability that costs you seconds you cannot afford. I committed. I moved out of the service access doorway at a low angle, staying close to the wall of the bay, using the cluster of equipment and cargo infrastructure along the perimeter to break up my silhouette. The industrial lighting in Level 7 is functional rather than aesthetic. It's bright in the center of the bay and significantly darker toward the walls, where the stanchions and equipment clusters cast irregular shadow. I used that. I moved along the eastern wall right side of the bay from my entry point in a low, controlled run, not sprinting, controlled. Fast enough to cover ground quickly, slow enough to stay quiet on the metal floor panels. The caveth were focused forward, on the princess, on whatever their plan was, and peripherally on the guard detail at the far end of the bay. They were not watching the eastern wall. I got to within about 30 meters of the cargo pallet mover before I had to reassess. The wreckage was the right side of the problem. The wrong side was that the remaining distance between me and it was a gap in the equipment clusters. About 12 meters of open, well-lit floor space, with nothing between me and the nearest caveth. 12 meters doesn't sound like much. With 8 armed caveth and the possibility that I was making every calculation wrong, 12 meters of open floor is a significant distance. I went through my actual assets. Sidearm licensed, standard capacity charged, not military grade, not something I would choose for a firefight with 8 professional mercenaries, functional as a deterrent and for the right situations. My actual advantages, they didn't know I was here. The Valkyrii were holding the caveth's primary attention. The ambient noise of the bay, the ventilation systems, the equipment hum, the acoustics of a large metal space gave me some cover. My plan was not, I want to be clear, something I am going to pretend was brilliant tactical thinking. It was improvised. It carried significant risk. And if I'm honest, the reason I attempted it was less a cool-headed calculation of acceptable risk, and more a fairly simple internal reaction to watching 8 mercenaries close in on a 16-year-old girl, while 12 soldiers with a sworn duty to protect her stood 40 meters away and did nothing. Some things make me angry in a way that clarifies rather than clouds. That was one of them. I pulled 2 things from my kit. A signal disruptor, small, handheld, designed to interrupt communication signals in a localized area. I use them in security consulting for controlled communication blackouts. And a personal deflector, which is a piece of human design technology that deserves some explanation because it was, in that moment, genuinely the thing that kept me alive. Personal deflectors are not shields. They don't create a force field. They work on a much more limited and specific principle. They generate an electromagnetic interference field around a small area, roughly personal body size, that disrupts the targeting systems of energy-based weapons. Pulse weapons, which is what the caveth were carrying, rely on a target lock component for accurate sustained fire. The deflector doesn't stop the energy. It disrupts the lock. Which means pulse weapon fire becomes inaccurate rather than impossible. You can still get hit, a lucky shot, a concentrated burst, a human aiming manually without the targeting assist, but the probability changes meaningfully. Human tech, designed by humans because we don't have the natural physical advantages of most compact species, and we've been quietly building technological equalizers for the last 100 years, because that's what humans do when the game is rigged against them. I activated both and moved. I crossed the 12-meter gap at a sprint. No cover, no hesitation. The signal disruptor seeding noise into the communication channels the caveth were using, the deflector humming against my chest. The nearest caveth heard me at about 6 meters. He turned. He brought his weapon up. He fired once, twice, the pulse bursts cutting through the air where I was, close enough that I felt the atmospheric disturbance, and missed both because the deflector had done its job on his targeting system. I hit him, not elegantly, shoulder first at a run, which is not a recommended tactical technique but which, when a human hits a stocky medium-height biped with the momentum of a full sprint, produces a result. He went sideways and down, and I went sideways with him, and I was behind the cargo mover before 3 of his companions had fully registered what had happened. The cargo mover wreckage was solid, heavy industrial polymer and steel frame. Pulse weapon fire hits it, and I can feel the impacts, but they're not coming through. Not immediately. And there, 3 feet from me in the shadows behind the wreckage, was Eva Velkorath. Close up, the first thing I noticed was her eyes. All 4 of them. The forward pair were the pale silver that Thessians have. The temple pair, the wider peripheral ones, were slightly dilated, which in Thessian emotional physiology indicates acute stress. She was scared. She was doing a remarkable job of holding herself together, but she was scared. The second thing I noticed was that her bioluminescent ridge lines, the ones along her skull and down the back of her neck, were flickering. Rapid, irregular. Not the controlled chromatic communication I'd seen in the guards. Something less controlled. Involuntary. She was looking at me the way someone looks at an unknown variable, in a situation that already has too many unknowns. I said in compact standard because I don't speak Theshan, and compact standard is the language everyone learns when they want to be understood. I'm a human security contractor. My name is Drav Holton. I am not affiliated with those people. I meant the Caveth, and I am not affiliated with your guards. Brief pause, then, I'd like to get you out of here. She stared at me for about 2 seconds. The pulse fire hitting the other side of the cargo mover was a continuing percussion. I could hear the Caveth regrouping after my entrance disrupted their formation. Then she said, in compact standard that was absolutely perfect because the Theshan educational system is rigorous about it. You're human. Yes. You came alone. Yes. My guards are, she started and then stopped. I didn't fill the silence, I waited. She said very quietly, they're not coming. I know. Something shifted in her expression. The 4 eyes, all 4 of them, focused on me with an intensity that was actually slightly unnerving, the way that 4 eyes of focus is more total than 2. Why, she asked just that, one word. And I had about a second to decide whether to give her a lie that would be comfortable or the truth that wouldn't be, and I chose the truth. I don't know, but we can figure that out later. Right now, I need you to move when I tell you and stay low, and don't argue with me. Another second of assessment from those 4 eyes. All right, she said. The next 4 minutes were the most concentrated and unpleasant 4 minutes I have experienced in 11 years of this work. The Caveth had regrouped. I'd taken one out of the fight, the one I'd shoulder charged, who was down and staying down, which meant 7 active. 7 armed professionals, and me with a sidearm, a deflector, and a signal disruptor that had about 90 seconds of effective life left in it before the Caveth's communications adapted. The cargo mover wasn't going to hold as cover indefinitely. They'd flank us. That was the obvious move, send 2 around each side, converge and pin us. Against 7, in a fixed position, with no reinforcement from the guard detail at the other end of the bay, that was a losing position. I needed to move. The docking cradle with the Theshan ship was about 40 meters to my right. Powered down but not dead. A diplomatic transport of that class has emergency systems that can be triggered externally if you have the access code or can interface with the external maintenance port. I didn't have the access code, but I had something that I suspected might be useful. The ship, I said to Eva, is there an emergency external access for it, something crew can trigger from outside? She looked at the ship, then back at me. The emergency manifest port, left side of the cradle housing. But it requires biometric validation from a Theshan Royal. Or from someone with a Theshan Royal next to them, I said. She understood immediately. Theshans are fast like that, the intellectual development thing I mentioned earlier. How do we get there? She asked. Fast, I said. The signal disruptor had maybe 30 seconds left. I triggered it to maximum output, burning the remaining charge in a single concentrated burst rather than the sustained low-level mode, which hit the Caveth communication net hard enough that I heard 2 of them audibly react, their formation communication disrupted. 20 seconds of real confusion. 20 seconds. Go, I said. She went. Low, fast, moving in the kind of crouch that you'd expect from someone who has clearly had some physical training, even if it wasn't for this specific situation. I went with her, slightly behind and to the right, keeping my body between her and the most likely angles of incoming fire, my sidearm up and tracking. The Caveth on the right flank saw us first. I fired twice, not to hit, to force cover to buy half a second and kept moving. 15 seconds. The two Cavith on the left flank were coming around the wreckage and heading to where we'd been. They hadn't processed where we'd gone yet. 10 seconds. We hit the cradle housing, the large structure that holds the ship in position, all metal and access panels and mechanical attachment points. The left side. I scanned for the manifest port. There, a panel about 5 feet up. Silver housing, blue border, clearly external maintenance access. 5 seconds. Now, I said. Eva pressed her hand against the panel. The biometric scanner ran. I could see the blue sweep of it. It took 3 seconds, 3 seconds that felt like something considerably longer, while 2 different groups of Cavith mercenaries were closing from 2 different directions. And then the panel opened and a console extended. Eva hit the emergency power sequence. She knew it without having to think about it, which told me something about how thorough the Theshan royal education is about emergency protocols. The ship began to wake up. Not immediately. Ship power-up sequences take time regardless of urgency. But the emergency lighting systems came on first, inside the ship, visible through the viewport. And then the docking cradle's own systems registered an active principle and triggered a secondary alert protocol that went to the station's security system. That last part was important because it generated a station-wide notification that a high-priority principal had initiated an emergency power protocol in Bay 7, which meant station security was now officially aware that something was very wrong and was required to respond. I had not, until that moment, been entirely sure the Valkyrie would do nothing if the station's own security entered the situation. But I was reasonably sure they would not fire on Mercenary station security forces in a situation that had now been flagged to the compact diplomatic layer. The political math changed the moment that notification went out. I felt the Cavith know it too. There's a particular quality to the hesitation that happens when people who are doing something that relies on secrecy realize the secrecy is gone. I've seen it before. You can feel it in the room. The nearest Cavith stopped advancing. I didn't stop watching him. Inside, I said to Eva. She moved up the emergency access ladder that had extended from the panel sequence. I followed, not taking my eyes off the Cavith until I was at the panel level, and then I went up in 3 fast movements and through the emergency hatch. The hatch sealed behind me. Inside the diplomatic transport, the emergency lighting was a soft amber that felt almost surreal after the industrial white of the docking bay. The ship smelled different from the station, cleaner, with a faint something that I couldn't identify but which Eva probably found familiar. She had her back against the interior bulkhead. Breathing controlled, she was working to control it, hands pressed flat against the wall behind her. The bioluminescence on her ridge lines was still flickering, but less violently than before. I put my back against the opposite wall and breathed. We had about 4 seconds of complete quiet. Then, why did you help me? I looked at her. She was looking back, all 4 eyes that focused in total attention. I could have said something diplomatic. I could have said something professional, talked about security contractor ethics, or the compact humanitarian protocols, or any of several things that would have sounded reasonable and appropriate. Instead, I said what was actually true, because your guards weren't. Her eyes didn't change expression in the human way. Theshan face muscles work differently. But her bioluminescence did something subtle that I didn't have the vocabulary to read. They're not going to be punished, she said. It wasn't a question. Probably not, I said, because lying seemed pointless. Do you know why they didn't come? I have theories, nothing I can prove right now. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you're bleeding. I looked down. The left side of my jacket, there was a scorch mark along the ribs. I hadn't felt it in the moment. Pulse weapon graze, probably during the crossing. The deflector had degraded enough by then that a near miss had gotten closer than intended. "I'm fine," I said. "Your species has a high pain tolerance threshold," she said. It sounded like something she was reciting from a compact species manual. "It's variable," I said. "Right now it's holding." Another silence. She said, "Drav Holton." "Yes." "From which system?" "Hello's third planet." "I don't know it." "Most people don't. We grow food and keep to ourselves mostly." "And you became a mercenary." "Security contractor," I said. Something happened in her expression. Not quite a smile, the Thessian face doesn't quite do that, but something adjacent. "What's the difference?" "About 800 credits per day on billing rate," I said. The something adjacent to a smile intensified slightly. Outside the ship, I could hear faintly through the hull the sounds of station security arriving, the pattern of movement, the commands. The Cavith were not going to hold against station security with the political situation already flagged at the compact diplomatic level. They would disengage. They might be detained. Whether they'd be prosecuted was a different and considerably more complicated question. Whether the people who hired them would face any consequences was a question I already had fairly dim expectations about. But that was later's problem. Right now we were inside a sealed ship with station security on the outside and the immediate threat dissolving, and for the moment that was enough. Resolution. The official station security response reached Base 7 in 11 minutes from the initial alert. 3 minutes after we sealed inside the ship, they had the bay contained. It took another 20 minutes before I was convinced to open the emergency hatch. That caution was not paranoia. I needed to hear specific confirmation protocols before I exposed the princess to an exterior situation I couldn't yet fully assess. The station security officers were patient about it, which I appreciated, and they provided the protocols. When I came out first, standard procedure when you're the security contractor, and the principal is behind you. I had my hands visible, and my ID flagged on my contractor chip, and I was met by 6 Mercenary station security officers in full tactical gear. They held me for about 30 seconds, which was fair. Unknown human emerging from a sealed vessel in an active security incident, credentials unverified. Then Eva came out behind me. The shift in the room was immediate. 6 security officers who had been treating me as an unconfirmed variable all simultaneously registered what they were looking at, and the entire energy of the situation changed. "She's safe," I said. "She's unharmed except for stress exposure." The Cavith, 7 of them, 1 already down, were attempting an extraction, not assassination, a live capture. One of the station security officers, a Furian, tall and thin with the distinctive amber-colored eye membranes, stepped forward. She said, "We have 4 Cavith in custody. 3 disengaged through secondary exits before we could close the bay. 1 is incapacitated in the bay, assumed that's the one from your entry." "Yes," I said. "The Royal Guard detail is being held at the bay entrance pending compact diplomatic inquiry," she said, and the particular careful neutrality with which she said it told me she found that situation as strange as I did. "Good," I said. I looked back at Eva. She had composed herself, remarkably actually. The bioluminescence on her ridge lines had steadied, still not fully controlled, but much closer to the deliberate, measured chromatic patterning of a trained royal rather than the involuntary flicker of acute stress. She was standing straight. She looked, externally, like someone who had decided to look like she had this under control. She was 16, or the Thessian equivalent, and she was standing in a secure docking bay that smelled like weapon discharge, with a diplomatic incident unfolding around her and a guard detail of her mother's most elite soldiers who were going to have to explain to someone very powerful why they had done nothing, and she was standing straight. I noted that, I filed it. The next hours were complicated. Compact diplomatic channels move faster than most bureaucratic systems when a member species royal is involved, especially when the recording systems of Mercenary Station's Bay 7 had captured the entirety of what happened. The diplomatic transport's own systems had logged the emergency power sequence with timestamp. My contractor chip had logged my entry, my movement, every significant second of those 4 minutes. Queen Thesha Velkarath, the third, was contacted within 2 hours. Her response, filtered through 3 layers of diplomatic protocol to reach the station security office, was described to me later as unambiguous in its emotional content by the Furian security officer, who delivered this with the studied diplomatic understatement of someone who had genuinely heard something alarming come through the communication system. The Velkarii Royal Guard detail was detained pending inquiry. I am not going to speculate on paper about why they didn't move. I have theories. I have theories that got considerably more structured in the months afterward when information came out through channels I won't specify. What I will say is, the compact inquiry was conducted, and the inquiry's findings were classified at a level that made them inaccessible to independent review, and the practical result was that nothing publicly actionable happened to the 12 soldiers who stood 40 meters from their princess and chose not to move. That is the compact working as designed. I was held at the station for 6 days pending interview and review, which I had expected and cooperated with fully. On the 3rd day, I received a formal communication from the Theshan diplomatic office that my actions had been reviewed and were considered. The precise phrasing was consistent with the legitimate protective function claimed by the contractor and substantively confirmed by all available recording and testimony. Which is diplomatic language for, you did what you said you did, and we believe you. On the 6th day, I was cleared to leave. On the 6th day, I was also asked to attend a meeting. The meeting room was in the station's diplomatic tier, level 2, which has the kind of atmospheric control and furnishing that makes it feel like an entirely different station from the cargo bays below. Soft lighting, calibrated temperature, surfaces that are designed to be aesthetically neutral across the major compact species' aesthetic preferences, which mostly means clean lines and nothing visually aggressive. Eva Velkarath was there. Not alone, she had 2 Theshan diplomatic staff with her, and there were 2 Mercenary Station security officers at the door. But the meeting itself was functionally just us. She looked different from Bay 7, fully composed, the Theshan equivalent of formal dress for a diplomat in transit, something between casual and official, that complicated register that royal families everywhere seem to develop for situations that are serious but not ceremonial. Her bioluminescence was steady and deliberate. She sat across a small table from me. I sat. She said, "I wanted to speak with you before you left." "I heard," I said. The diplomatic staff had been fairly direct about the purpose of the meeting. "I've reviewed the recording," she said, "all of it." "All right. You moved without knowing whether the deflector would be sufficient." "The math was in the acceptable range," I said. "For a compact species with equivalent physical resilience, perhaps," she said. "Humans are not in the top physical resilience tier." I had to acknowledge that, no. You also had no particular obligation to intervene. You were not contracted to my protection. You were not even contracted to this station. "That's true." "Why?" she asked, and it was the same question as before in the ship, but this version felt different, more considered. Like she had been thinking about what answer she wanted and was checking it against mine. I thought about the answer for a moment. "My honest answer," I said finally, "is that I've spent 11 years watching the compact operate on the assumption that different rules apply to different species and different power levels, and sometimes that produces situations like the one in Bay 7. And I have enough of a temper about that particular principle that, when I see it producing a situation where a kid is alone, and the people who are supposed to protect her have decided she isn't worth the risk, I find it difficult to walk away. A pause. A kid, she said, with something careful in the tone. Approximately, I said, by your developmental timeline. Another silence. Then my mother's office will contact your firm, she said. There will be a formal compensation arrangement for what happened here, beyond the standard contractor rates. That's not necessary, I said. It is to us, she said simply. And there was something in that, not an argument, just a statement of how it was going to be. All right, I said. She looked at me for a moment, all four eyes that focused attention, and then she said, You don't speak Thessian. No, I know a few words, nothing useful. You should learn it, she said, as if this was a practical recommendation rather than a strange thing to say to a human mercenary you'd met 48 hours ago in a firefight. Why, I asked. Because, she said, I expect we'll speak again. Ending line. I flew out of Murren Station on the 7th day. The merchant's delayed ship had finally arrived. I'd completed the escort contract to Kundara without incident, and life had resumed its professional routine as it tends to do. But I kept thinking about Bay 7. Not about the Kavith, not about my own moves, not about the tactical mechanics of those 4 minutes. About the 12 Velkarii soldiers standing at the far end of that bay. About the exact quality of the stillness they held, while their princess was alone on the wrong side of it. About the fact that the investigation was classified and nothing happened. I thought about it across 3 different contracts over the following months. I thought about it on transit ships and in temporary quarters, and in the particular quiet of a long shift when there's nothing to do but sit with your own thoughts. And eventually, what crystallized out of all that thinking was something simple. The compact, the whole vast, ancient, 6,000-year-old political architecture of the Galactic Compact runs on the assumption that loyalty is a function of power, that the most loyal thing you can be is loyal to whoever holds the most authority over you, that when an order is given by the right person at the right level, it will be followed, and that is how the structure holds together. What happened in Bay 7 was that system working as designed. Someone at a level of power sufficient to make the Velkarii calculate differently had made a decision, and 12 soldiers decided that the calculus of following that decision was better than the calculus of dying for the girl they were sworn to protect. That's not a failure of the individuals, exactly. That's a failure of a structure that treats loyalty as negotiable based on who holds more power. Humans are different about this. Not universally, not perfectly. We have our own failures of loyalty and our own betrayals and our own corruptions. I am not making a claim that we are better. What I am saying is that, for whatever reason, maybe it's the history, the particular brutal education that being the youngest and weakest species in the compact gave us, the fact that we've been operating on the margins long enough that we develop different values about who you stand for when things get hard. For whatever reason, when I stood in the shadow of that service access doorway and ran my calculations and came up with a risk profile that was objectively too high for the reward, I moved anyway. Not because of a contract, not because of a political calculation, not because of what someone with more power than me had decided was worth doing. Because she was alone and nobody else was moving. The galaxy is 6,000 years old, or the parts of it that kept records are. Humanity has been spacefaring for maybe 200. The old species had their time to figure out what loyalty means and what courage costs and what a sworn promise is worth. And somewhere in those 200 years, while the galaxy looked at us and saw the new species, the young species, the small and fragile species with no natural armor and no natural bioluminescence and no 6,000-year cultural history. Somewhere in that time, We figured out something that maybe got lost in 6,000 years of power and politics and survival calculus. Some things you do because they're right. Not because they're safe. Not because someone told you to. Not because the math works out in your favor. Because a kid is crouched behind a broken cargo mover in a dark bay, and everyone who should be moving isn't, and the distance between doing something and doing nothing is exactly the length of your own willingness to close it. That's what I keep coming back to. That's the thing that doesn't leave me. Not the firefight, not the 4 minutes, not the diplomatic language or the classified inquiry or the formal compensation arrangement or even the strange quiet certainty in 4 silver eyes looking at a human she'd never met and deciding, in a crisis, in the dark, with no time that he was worth trusting. Just that distance. 12 soldiers, 40 meters, a 16-year-old girl. And the space between deciding and moving that most people, from most species, never manage to close. Humans have always been stubborn about that particular gap. I hope we stay that way.